I don't think many of us do enough of the work ourselves to look inward and understand what our values are. We have a sense of what they are, of course, because we live the lives that we live.
You can determine what your values are very simply by saying what's important to me in X, right? So what are my life values? What's important to me in life? What are my career values? What's important to me in my career? And so on. And then you list those things. Eventually there's a process and you can identify top values. But the interesting thing is a lot of the time people say what their values are, right? I value family, I value adventure or traveling. But then I ask them, well, okay, how many hours a week are you at work? Oh, I'm working 80 hours a week, right? How much are you seeing your family? And when they don't live in alignment with what they say their values are, either they're lying about what their values are or they're not lying about values, but they're just not living to those values. You create this internal friction, which ultimately will end up in dis-ease in the body.
Hello, Harry. Good to see you again, my friend. How you doing?
Good evening, Nick. Yeah, I'm good. I actually, just before we jumped on the call, it's been, I don't know where you are, but it's such a sunny day here in Brighton. But I've been kind of in most of the day doing jobs, and it got to about 5 o'clock, 5:15. I thought, I haven't even seen the sea yet, and it's such a clear day. And that's why I asked you, I texted you or whatever, and I said, like, are we meeting like 6 or is it gonna be like 10 past, quarter past? Because actually that makes a big difference. And I didn't get the response back anyway, so I just went for a walk and checked my phone when I was walking. But I went for a walk along the beach. There's a bunch of people playing beach volleyball because there's that new beach volleyball thing near me, and it was a bit of a reset. And we were talking at the weekend at a health event about how we rest and how we reset. And one of the things I do is I like to go for a walk, and it was just a recharge. And so I'm feeling actually pretty good. But how are you, my friend?
Very good. Well, actually, I haven't seen much of the outdoors. Oh, that's a lie. I went to the doctors this morning to follow up on my ear problems, which have pretty much been cleared with. But I've picked up COVID since then, so I'm still not feeling 100%. I'm still recovering now from COVID after the antibiotics from the ears being cleared up. But he's given me the all clear. I can start swimming, so that's good. It's the only outdoors I've seen. I'm back in this dark studio room now. I've missed the sunshine. The earlier finishes now. I can see it's starting to get dark outside. I've moved from one office to another office and I'm back upstairs. So yeah, it hasn't been the most exciting of days in terms of getting that natural light in for me. I've been head down trying to catch up on work and doing various bits and pieces because I've got some events next week. So I'm in London from Wednesday to Friday giving some talks for some clients. So I'm quite looking forward to that. And then the following week, I'm away doing some other talks and then I'm up in Manchester. So it's like conference season. So I've got to learn lots of different talks for lots of different clients, and that's I enjoy doing it, but it's quite a lot of work to do. So I'm kind of head down at the minute.
Yeah, I feel you. Last week I had 5 workshops. I think I don't know if I was talking to you or someone else. Like I lose my head with it. Like 5 workshops in 5 days, and they're all 5 different
Yeah,
locations. Luckily for me, and this was all in the schools, all of the groups were basically good. The last group was really good. I think the last couple of groups were really good, and that was good. And then I've got this week technically off in terms of actually delivering, although I'm delivering virtually on Wednesday. And then I go back and I've got effectively two weeks on the trot of back to back. And people listening to this might say, well, what's the big deal, right? You're doing a 5-day week, right? Like we all do a 5-day week. I can't tell you how different it is when you're in front of people for 6-7 hours, bringing the energy with 30, 15-year-olds who often don't want to be there. And you're going to different locations, hour, 2 hours each way. It's very different. Like I've worked in offices for a long time. I've even done other work where maybe you're delivering and it's a different vibe. So basically my focus is always on execute and recover, repeat, execute, recover, repeat when I'm doing that. So I feel you. I mean, and also you've got to just stay healthy, right? With these, when you're traveling a lot, like you're going to be doing.
it's taken its toll. I'm pretty sure I've picked this up from going to the doctors last week. I said to the doctor, and he was like, "Yeah, I've had COVID." He'd been off with it himself, so I was like, "Oh, brilliant, that makes sense." Well, look, we've had a listener question, and I thought this would be a really interesting topic for us to discuss, particularly because we live our lives very differently. So there may be some, I don't know, maybe we'll see things differently, maybe we won't. Let's see where it goes. But the question was really around. I got a message from one of our listeners that said, "Nick and Harry, would you mind discussing how to live in alignment with our values when our friends, our family, our partners, or basically our loved ones don't necessarily share them with us?" So, yeah, quite a common thing. We sometimes our values come together, but often our values can be very, very different. And so how do we manage that? You want to live in alignment, but at the same time, you've got to coexist with difference, and that can be a challenge. So I thought, you know what, that's a really interesting topic to discuss, because I think living in alignment with your values, it doesn't mean forcing other people to share yours. I think that's a really key distinction here. It does mean compromise, particularly if in a relationship. Obviously, I'm talking more in my own marriage, if you like, and with kids and other things. But you're still got to maintain your integrity, your peace, your compassion. I think coexisting with difference is a challenge for a lot of people. For a lot of people.
I mean, I've got
But
quite a lot, I think, of thoughts on this subject because I've written about it in Super Vitality. I've written a whole chapter on values, but also a whole an element where we're talking about the exact question that the listener was talking about, where you are living in a certain way, and then the people around you are not really conducive or supportive of that. And I personally went through that probably 15 years ago, and it probably took about 5 years to reach some kind of equilibrium where I'm happy to share how I kind of rationalize things. But also, I'm in a slightly different position in that having a significant other who doesn't share your values or your change in direction or your transformation or whatever the thing might be, which is leading to the change in values, is really challenging. And yeah, so we can dive into that a little bit more. So I'm happy to kind of kick off with it, or if you want, you got some
yeah,
any thoughts or
I think there's probably some distinctions to be had. And I imagine that you've kind of got real two ends to the scale of this. I think you never want to be living small. And there are a lot of people I think that live small. And what I mean by that is in potentially in relationships where your voice is silenced, you live muted, you feel afraid to speak up. I think that's a very, and it doesn't mean we don't discuss it today because I think it's very important. There are a lot of people that do live like that, very sadly, or they live in, completely against, they go and follow career histories because they think that's what their parents wanted of them. And there's, I think you can go to the extreme. I think also though, there's an element where you can be absolutely in love and it's not quite that oppressive. It's just that, you can love people whose values different. You just want to make sure you don't betray your own in that process. And I think a lot about, Viktor Frankl, we've talked about a lot on this show. And he says, he who has a why to live by can deal with almost any how. So I think it'll be good today to talk about how do we get deep and understanding what our why is, so we can understand how we can live with that, in that way. But also, if you look at the top 5 regrets of the dying, one of those is I wish I had the courage to live a life that was true to myself, not the life that others expected of me, and they
yeah.
could
I
be your
mean,
partner
I
or
think
parent.
this
So lots to unpack there.
this I mean, that last bit kind of jumps to something that I remember talking about many times, including with a good friend of mine who was asking me, and I'm sure I've shared this before, who was asking me after he'd had his heart attack. So he had a heart attack when he was 33, so probably around 13 years ago or something like that. And he wanted to make, I think, some changes. He didn't really at the time so much. I think he has a bit now, but I remember him being in the car asking me, because at that time I'd recently changed my diet, I think maybe a year or two earlier. And he was asking me something about that, because he was saying, isn't it difficult? And it is difficult, because I noticed when I changed my diet just how much of our social being revolves around food. And I've got quite a few friends, and they just want to go out for steak, or they want to go out for this, that, and the other. And so I was slowly being disinvited, really, from things, or not invited, I should say, rather than disinvited, like not invited to certain things. And even to this day, I can probably count on one hand the amount of times I've been invited out for dinner around someone's house, right, these days, because they just don't know what to cook for me. And I remember saying to him, look, at the end of the day, at some point you have to decide whether you want to live your life by your standards or by somebody else's. And I think that's the crux of it, is it takes a lot of backbone or a little guts to be able to sort of be there and be the outcast in a certain thing because of your values. And when it comes to your significant other, I think it's a real it's a question that needs to be asked right up front. Like, what are your, understanding what that other person's values are. Now, we might have similar values as well, but also there's a distinction to be made by the way I describe it when I coach people is you have a value, but then you have a belief around that value. So what needs to happen in order for that value to be met? So you and I both might value fitness as a high value, right? Because we both do, right? But what we believe about that is different, right? For you, you've got to be doing competitions, you've got to be, going through that kind of harder graft. You also, I guess, more into, like, not singular sports, but like defined sports, like, you do your triathlon, you do your swimming, you do your cycling. I have a different, like, same value, but different belief around fitness, right? And so you might have the similar values, but understanding that different beliefs is important as well. And so I think when you come to your significant other, having those conversations earlier, and you can kind of, even without the conversation, can see, because yeah, I mean, I remember, like, some friends asking me where, oh, because obviously, as you know, I'm single, and have been pretty much most of my life in a way. But they're always asking, oh, but would you not date someone that smokes, for example? And I'll be like, well, no, right? And they go, but what? She might be a really nice person, but I go, but, like, I know by the habits that that person has that we don't share certain values, right, together, because I value, like, health is a quite a high priority. Now, they may argue that they do as well, or they might go to the gym, but it still wouldn't work for me, right? I can't stand being around people that smoke in my vicinity, right? Even
I think
outside.
with two things to bear in mind here. Number one is I don't think many of us do enough of the work ourselves to look inward and understand what our values are. We have a sense of what they are, of course, because we live the lives that we live. We don't necessarily sit down and actually go, you know what, like you have, there are certain things that are, they're deal breakers, right? They're non-negotiables for you. So you're very clear on what your values are, and you value security, I know, very highly as well for different reasons. And you know what you're looking for. But I don't think a lot of listeners and a lot of people out there generally do that work themselves. I think where it gets muddy, and this is where I think it gets really difficult. And I get a sense, I don't know, so apologies, listener, if you're watching this or listening to this, and this isn't true. But I think sometimes when love is involved, it gets very difficult. And sometimes your values, of course, they can change. There's the authenticity paradox where we grow, we evolve, and our values and beliefs and things change as we go through. But the love can form first, and you might have a love from a parent. It could be a parent that you don't want to disappoint, which means you can often end up living a life outside of alignment with your own values or beliefs or what you want to do, because you don't want to let those people down. Now, I know we've said many times on this show, right? There's two things we can always control. That's our attitude and our actions. But sometimes we take the actions that aren't in alignment with those values because we are fearful of rejection. We're fearful of letting somebody down. We're fearful maybe someone will leave us, or even the other way around. And I'll give an example. Very sadly, someone that we know in our life committed suicide last week. They walked into the sea and didn't come back. And sometimes we're fearful of taking the things that we really or truly believe in because we're worried that the person we love might take an action like that. So again, we don't do the things that we really feel like or compelled that we want to do because we're worried about the other person. And I think love sometimes muddies those waters. So in that situation, what would be your advice? And I've got some
Um,
clear views. I might come to those
yeah,
in a moment, but I'll
I
get
mean,
your view.
firstly, let me just say I'm sorry to hear about your friend. I had a close buddy commit suicide 20 years ago now, actually. And it's the leading cause of death in men under 45 in the UK, and probably in many other parts of the world. So apologies, not apologies, but condolences on that. But I think when it comes to not living in line with your values, and I do an exercise on values in my books, but I also do it with companies, and I often get them to formulate what their values are, and you can determine what your values are very simply by saying what's important to me in X, right? So what are my life values? What's important to me in life? What are my career values? What's important to me in my career? And so on. And then you list those things, and eventually there's a process, and you can identify top values. But the interesting thing is, a lot of the time people say what their values are, right? I value family. I value, like, adventure or traveling. But then I ask them, well, okay, how many hours a week are you at work? Oh, I'm working 80 hours a week, right? How much are you seeing your family, right? And when they don't live in alignment with what they say their values are, either they're lying about what their values are, or they're not lying about values, but they're just not living to those values. You create this internal friction, which ultimately will end up in dis-ease in the body, right? It will lead to some kind of conflict internally. And so I think that's important when you're thinking about it in terms of a significant other, because they're the most important part of your life. And we come to things at different times. That's the other thing. So let's say you're going on a journey, right? Personal development, whatever. You have it in your head that that person in your life should also be on that journey with you at the same pace. And the reality is that's not their role. Their role isn't to do that with you. Their role is to live their life. And so the first thing I think is to understand is that you have to do you and they're going to do them. And trying to pull them along is really not going to work. I tried to do this for 5 years or more with friends and family, where I would be like learning things and wanting to share with them and wanting them to change and wanting them to do this. And I was leading to frustration. And I actually came up with a friend philosophy, if you like, to help deal with that, which I can explain later. But I think at some point I just got to the point where actually I can't pull these people along with me, much as I love them, and it's not their journey to do that, right? But what I can do is reach out to those people that are in alignment with my values, create circles of friendships around that. And then also part of the reason why I decided to write books and speak and do all that is that I thought if enough other people listen to me and are paying to hear my advice, then maybe the people closest to me will actually start to think, oh, maybe there's something to it. So I don't know if that answered the question or not. Maybe not, but
No, well, I think it's a difficult question to answer, but I think a few things come to light. I think for me, there are a couple of tests we probably need to do. I think sometimes we are aware, but we don't admit it to ourselves, is probably how I'd put it. So intuitively, we probably are aware we're not living in alignment. But I think living your values for me would be showing up as the same person privately and publicly, even when it costs approval. So if we're not doing that, then I'm probably hiding a part of myself for whatever reason in that situation. And I say that going back to being left to feel small at home sometimes if you've got a relationship or with your parents or whatever it might be, or even your friends, you sometimes sort of create another version of yourself to fit in. And it has that feeling, as you mentioned, that disease inside the body where you kind of feel like this isn't right, but I don't want to lose my friends. We live in that space of fear that if I don't live this way, maybe my friends will reject me, or maybe my parents will reject me, maybe my partner will reject me. So we live in that space of fear, and it's really difficult. But if you sit back and analyze and go, well, are you really happy in that moment? I think for me, the bigger risk would be staying in those relationships or in that career journey, if it's for your parents, or in that friendship group, realizing you've lost 10 or 15 or 20 years of your life, and you look back and go, where did it go? And now and that regret that would come later because you've tried to fit into something that just wasn't actually you. And eventually I think that will come out. Eventually you'll break free because your body, every part of you will want to do it. And you'll go, why didn't I do this earlier? Or the opposite is those people will let you down and you go, why didn't I do this earlier? Because after all that, I've been let down at the end of it anyway.
I mean, what you talk about and this whole topic reminds me of a lady yesterday, actually. So I was at it's a well-being week here in Brighton, actually, and there was an event that I went to, a 2-day festival, if you like. Honestly, it was quite underwhelming, if I'm honest. I primarily went because I thought maybe I'll meet some people. I'm new to the area and everything else. But the talks were really poor. Yeah, it was just very underwhelming. But one of the ladies that was in the audience was asking one of the speakers this very question because she was saying how she came down from London for it, but she either lied to her family or didn't tell them where she was going because they are she was fearful, to use your words and hers, about how they would react or respond to it, and how she's having to hide this part of her life. And it was just like, going to a wellness event. It's not like intense personal development work, right? Anything, but um, and so your point there, and what jumped into my head as she was speaking, and I was thinking, how miserable must it be to live like in a relationship where you feel like your partner is so unsupportive of your desire to self betterment or whatever, that you're lying, and it might get to that point where, like, one of two things happen, right? You go 15 years down the road and you're like, well, I've wasted all this time with them, or they do something 15 years down the line, and you think, why did I spend all that time with that person? Yeah, and I think like we're so fearful. I say we, right? People can be so fearful of change, and we're so used to status quo. It's like better the devil you know than being with be alone. My challenge is that I'm not willing to quote unquote settle. I'm not, and the older you get, the more comfortable you become in your own skin, which is also a bad thing because you have less ability for compromise, let's say. But I don't think I could see like having waited, let's say 20 years to meet someone, that I would just go with someone that didn't jive with me, because I'd rather be alone than be with someone that makes me fearful of being who I really am. So I think sometimes you might have to so I think two things there, right? You might have to take a look in the mirror and say, is this relationship working? Is this partner for me? Or is it that the approach that I'm using to bring them into my space maybe needs to be tweaked? Because there could also be that, right? Sometimes it's the messenger, and hearing the same stuff from a different person, somehow doing a different approach to get them into that world that you're in could work, or it could be timing, it could be all sorts of things.
Compromise is always important in a relationship, but compromise always has to go both ways. I think that's the key. You need to come to, as you mentioned the word equilibrium earlier. You have to come to an equilibrium with your partner or your parent or whoever it is that's causing it. As you know, I'm writing a book at the moment on HR, which is about working title is Safe to Lead. It's about psychological safety. And one of the things organizations I would say need to do is psychological safety starts with self acceptance. You have to be willing to look at yourself or your business, your organization, and go, actually, we've got some problems here before you can make it safe. And some organizations are um, resistant to doing that, shall we say. But I think if you think about this in a personal context, the most important relationship we have with anybody is ourselves. And you'll know that. And if that relationship will absolutely degrade if you don't spend and dedicate quality time to it. It's like anything. If you don't give time to something, then it starts to erode. And I think if you start to abandon your values in a relationship or with a parent or even in work, whatever it might be with your friends, just to keep the peace, you slowly start to erode that relationship with yourself. But you don't see it happening. It can happen over time. And I think that's something just to be really, really mindful of.
One thing I would add is that we have different facets, right? Different elements to our personality. And one of the meditations I listen to all the time, Jerry and Esther Hicks one about relationships. Actually, it's a great 15-minute one that I often listen to, and it does talk about accepting people for who they are and all that, and how we need to be different, but how we are only who we are in relation to other people. Yeah, I don't know if this is going to make sense, but our personality is kind of defined by our interactions with other people, because we are different people around other people. It doesn't mean you're being fake or you're putting a
No,
mask on.
no, I get that.
It just
We have
means that,
different identities depending on the
yeah,
situation for
and
sure.
so um, like embracing that, but also when it comes to how you interact with people. I remember Tony Robbins years ago, because he was talking about this very thing. Because often when you go on this personal development journey, or one partner goes to say a 4-day UPW, Unleash the Power Within, Tony Robbins event, comes back, completely different, right? From that person. It's really scary for that partner. In fact, partners probably should go together. In fact, definitely should go together. But he was saying something about, because someone was saying, yeah, but with your friends, yeah, maybe you can ditch your friends, but your family. And he was like, love your family, but choose how you spend your time with them. And I remember I've had to go through this with my own family, because there are certain elements or areas of my family, extended or otherwise, that I choose very carefully how I spend time with them and how I interact with them. Now, when I'm in a limited amount of time, I tend to not share the kind of content that or conversations that I would normally, and that's okay. But if I was to spend inordinate amount of time with that person, having to constantly suppress what I really wanted to talk about, that would really start to grate on me internally. So for me, I decided, look, I need to spend time around these people, around whatever Christmas or family gatherings or whatever. but I also don't need to impart my ideas onto them in that 2 hours that I see them at a family gathering or something like that. If I was seeing them daily and all that, and then suddenly I'm suppressing things, that's a different story. And also, when it came to friends, I'll just kind of share something that really helped me with friendship, because for me, the friends thing was a bigger challenge than the family. And the reason for that is because a lot of my friends I've had since the age of about 5 or 6 years old. And I've given up on almost everything I've tried, right? Music, martial arts, football, scouts, like nothing has stuck my entire life except for my friendship groups. And so for me, I didn't want to lose those friendship groups. And I noticed as I was going down this journey that I had less and less that I wanted to that I had in common with them, and that I was willing to interact. And I felt conversations weren't there. I didn't really want to do the activities they were doing. I started to see things in a different light, and that really hurt me for a long time, because I was thinking, I don't want to lose, I don't want to detach that. And I remember one of my girlfriends saying, I came back from like a night out with them, and she was asking me, how was it? And I was like, it was all right. And she's like, why are you spending 4 hours of your time for something that's just all right? And I go, well, I've known these guys from like 6 years old, blah, blah, blah. And something I kind of I think it was from Aristotle that I got this idea from, but I adapted it slightly, and I call it 5 minute, 5 hour, and 5 day friends. And how, the 5 minute friends are the friends that you see now and then. You're nice to them, you enjoy your conversation, you chat to them at the bar, it's all good. And then the 5 day friends on the other extreme is, people you would spend loads of time with, maybe go on a camping trip, holiday with them, whatever. And then the 5 hour friends somewhere in between. And the biggest thing realization for me was the ability to move between those. So a 5 day friend, right? My five day friends, like the ones from like many, many years ago, now they may be 5 hour friends, or they may be 5 minute friends, but they're still friends, right? But I've compartmentalized that. I haven't had to remove my friends, which is what I was fearful of. I just moved them into a different bucket. And then likewise, people that were 5 minute friends, right? People I would see at conferences here, there, and everywhere. And then I kept seeing them regularly, became 5 hour friends, and some 5 day
I'm
friends.
pretty sure you told me this story 'cause I hadn't heard it before when we first met. Going right back, and this will make sense. When we met in Thai Garden in the rest before we started the podcast, and we had this conversation because we were talking about the self-help journeys and how things change. And I think we talked about energy audits, where even with an energy audit, you should look at the people in your life. Do they drain you or do they energize you? And they can shift. And in that instance, they used to energize you when you're younger. Maybe they drain you now because you're not in the same space. And it links to, as you said, we grow, we evolve, and our views change. I think also you make a good point, whether you're aware of it or not, but certainly it was a good point in my mind in how I received it, which is we also grow through discomfort. So we do need that challenge. We need those disagreements about values. You and I have them all the time. That's how we build our knowledge. We build empathy. We also build our emotional range. As long as we're doing it consciously, it's about not being dogmatic with it and me forcing an opinion on you and making you feel smaller as a result. But debate is good because you do grow by learning and seeing things from a totally different perspective. And I think, we need respect for difference, and we know that authenticity will always beat conformity, right? So it's just getting that balance right. But I just get the suspicion, if you get that message as we did about living in alignment or out of alignment, that maybe it's not being met equally. Maybe there is that forceful nature of either the individual who's sent it in is has different values and wants to get away, or the person they're living with is pushing their values on them. I don't know which way around it is. It's obviously a very sensitive subject. Um, but I do think there are some, it's worth mentioning we can grow from it. But I think you get a sense internally, we listen to our bodies as to whether or not it's healthy or whether it isn't. Um, and I saw a quote from Mahatma Gandhi that said, "Peace is not the absence of conflict; it's the ability to cope with it." But I think there are limits, and we shouldn't be forced to cope with something that's completely out of alignment, because before you know it, time has gone by, and you look back and go, I don't need to be here. It doesn't
Well, this
feel
is this
feel
is the
right.
thing, is I often get a challenge by, say, my mum about certain decisions I've made with certain, like, people in our extended family. And I say, "Look," because she's like, "Well, you should be able to, like, live in harmony with them, or do this, that, and the other." And I'm like, "Look, if I like trip and bang my head onto a nail sticking out the wall, that's one thing. But if I continually take my head out, bang it in, take my head out, bang it in, right, that's on me. And so whilst I understand that I might have to occasionally trip and hit my head, right, me doing it repeatedly is a choice that I don't want to make. And so if I feel like my interaction with someone is like banging my head against the wall, I will choose not to do that on the times where I have the ability to avoid that head banging, as it were. And so I think that's something that people have to get comfortable with. And I do think that people really have to get comfortable when it comes to values and living in alignment with them. And as horrible as this sounds in a way, is you might have to get used to a lonely journey, because if you are living by your own standard, I had standards during the last 5 years, right? That I won't go into the specifics of it, but I chose to make a choice that was against the narrative, right? And that led to certain challenges, right? Both with family, with work, with all sorts of things. But I wanted to make a decision based on what I believed to be true, what I valued in life, and living by my standards and not being subjected to other people's standards for what it meant to be healthy or whatever the thing was. And so it is a lonely journey, right? But on that lonely journey, you do find other lonely individuals who are also living by their standards and are more receptive, not necessarily that they're living the same as you, but they're more, like you say, able to coexist with differences. And it's the differences that make us a rich society, because if we all had the same values and beliefs, we would all, I say this to people, and I say this as a joke, but actually it's true. We would all have the same job, live in the same street, in the same house, go on the same holidays, if we all believed the same thing. And so we are supposed to have different beliefs and different values. Where it becomes challenging is those people closest to you, if their values don't align, then, at some point, if it's really a case of it's never going to happen, there may have to be a difficult choice that's made. That's just the reality,
I
unfortunately.
think I to echo what you said, 'cause I'm in full agreement. We need a little bit of darkness to see the light as well. Like, we're not all robots. It's like if we're only ever happy all the time, we wouldn't really know what happiness was, because you need to have an understanding of what the other side of the coin looks like. The yin and the yang, which you usually have in your background, is important, right? I remember something you said. I don't know which episode it was. It was a while ago, but it stuck with me because I've used this with my daughter, and she's just started college. She's trying to find her tribe, and you said your vibe attracts your tribe. And I think, your vibe has changed and you have a different tribe now, and it's been mindful of that. But equally, if your vibe is coming introverted, if your voice is being muted, if you feel like you're not yourself, the same is still true here. So you might find you become lonely for other reasons, because your personality shifted. You're no longer the fun person. This goes back to whether you are generally living your true self publicly and privately. And if you're not, then something is out of alignment, in my opinion. And I think that when you feel small in that instance, and you will feel muted, and I use muted a lot because in the place of work you have muted and unmuted cultures. And I talk a lot about this in terms of inclusivity within business. And I think you can be equally as muted in a relationship, or muted with your parents. You don't say what you really think, or don't feel like you're able to find your voice. But it makes you it doesn't help, and eventually your vibe will be suppressed. You'll feel lonely, you'll feel sad, you won't have the energy that you want to have, and actually your friends will start leaving you eventually, because they won't want to be around that individual either. So it can be a really, really self-fulfilling prophecy here, and it's sometimes very difficult to break your way out. I think you've mentioned that the tribe you're born into doesn't always mirror your vibe either. That's the challenge of families. I think the task sometimes is, as you've done very well, is to hold on to your truth without holding contempt, without holding people against you, particularly in a family instance. But I think it is a challenge. I think if someone is living with you and you have different values, I think that's okay. But if they're trying to persuade you over to your or to theirs, that's where I think it can become challenging.
It's really hard because I think I have a very limited exposure to that, because I can choose to run my life my own way. However, what I would say is I was thinking about this just the other day, actually, because Um, as you know, when I'm in London, like my mum moved into the place I was living in. I've moved to Brighton, but I live with her when I'm in London, and I was there last week, and I'll be there next week, and everything. And yeah, she has different ideas about her morning routine. Like she'll want to wake up, maybe be in bed, put the news on, come downstairs, and when I'm not there, she'll put like both TVs on, one on mute, but so that she could sort of hear the thing and watch things. And I hate that, right? And she knows I hate that. So when I'm there, she doesn't do that. But I was thinking, yeah, because I know just how important my start to the day can be for whether I go in one direction or the other. And and so I would find it really hard. I mean, where was I? I was staying at a friend's last week because last week or 2 weeks ago, whenever I went back to London, 2 weeks ago probably, because he happened to live nearer there, and he was talking about how he had a housemate a while back who was like a gym person or something, like a personal trainer, and he was all on about it, right? He was like doing his meal prep on a Sunday for the week ahead. He was in bed by 10. He was doing that. He actually ended up making my friend feel worse because my friend was wanting to be healthier, but by seeing that around him, it made him feel worse. But I was also on the flip side thinking if I spent a huge amount of time with my friend there, or there's another friend of mine as well, we have so different ways of how we might do things. Because like I like my lights off in the evening, right? I like not having noise so much in the morning. I like to, and I say to my mum, because she tries to have a conversation with me in the morning about things that really don't need to be had at that time in the morning. I say, I want to get this stuff done first. And I would just find it really, really challenging to be there. And I didn't realize it, but growing up, it's a similar thing. You're in a household and you have very limited control because there may be siblings, there's the manic morning rush, and you'll succumb to what that is. And then because I've lived by myself for so many years, I was able to develop my own reality, if you like, which works for me better. You know, you'll always adapt when you compromise with other people, but I'm just saying, I feel for the person who may be in a relationship and find that that person is not sharing those values. And, my limited advice would be, maybe it's about how it's been approached anyway, right? Maybe that person needs a different message or different messenger to pull them in alignment. Maybe they have never thought about their values, and maybe actually a conversation had together
I
around
think
this
that's good
basis.
advice. I don't think we do that enough.
I
I
don't
think
think
it's
I think we should have couples therapy before you have. It's a bit like John F. Kennedy, right? The time to fix the roof is in the summer, right?
yeah, yeah.
Not in the winter.
Well,
And it's the
it's the
same.
same for coaching, right? People think they need coaching. I work as a coach when there's a problem. The best time to get coaching is when there aren't any problems. So you want to be preventative, right?
Well, I had
Rather than
who was going for couples therapy, and I asked him, I was like, "Oh, what's going on?" He go, "Oh, nothing." But he was doing group couples therapy with his wife, but he's like kind of proactive. He's into personal development. He's done a few things as well. And so I was thinking that's actually a really, really good idea because the thing is, a lot of the time,
prevention is better than cure, is the cliche, right?
and
And
also what happens, I think, in relationships is there's things that like irk you, or they call it the ick now, whatever. They irk you a little bit, but they're not enough to say anything. And the way I describe it now in relationships I've had is it leaves a charge within me. And I think we've talked about this idea of charge before, but there's a slight charge, right? Maybe that person hasn't done anything that warrants you actually saying anything you don't feel, but actually it's left a little bit of a weird thing in.
it
And
reminds me of the movie The Breakup. It's one of my favorite lines. I
oh, I
think it's
love
The
the
Breakup,
breakup movie.
where
Yeah,
Jennifer Aniston says, to Vince Vaughn, isn't it?
is
You
it
know,
the lemon?
I want you to want to
Oh,
wash
I
up."
want you to want to wash up.
And it's
Yeah,
like, it's not about the washing up though, is it? That's the point. It's about, I want you to want to do something that means I don't have to do it. That means that you're a help, that we are a team, those kind of things, right? And sometimes we live in our own little bubbles and we view things differently. I think, and also just echoing your point here, I think ultimately sometimes you've got to make really difficult decisions in order to find happiness. Now, I've got a friend, a really close friend of mine, who you've cycled with, which is Moo, right? He comes from quite a religious background where arranged marriages are the norm, where you can't necessarily marry outside of the religion. And he's had to take some really difficult decisions in his life to find the happiness that was inside him. He didn't want to conform. Conformity in that instance, um, authenticity, should I say, was more important than conformity, and that was a difficult decision. He risked, being ostracized by his family, his brothers, and sisters, and you've got to make sometimes some really, really difficult decisions to find happiness. And that could be the same in a relationship, and I think it's difficult because I think even I'm thinking as I speak here, but even internally we can have conflicts, right? We can, I know you value security, but you also value autonomy. Now, sometimes those things can be a tension with each other. You could have achievement versus benevolence or whatever it might be. We have internal conflicts. And I think even in a relationship, you can have, I absolutely love this person. They're a great parent, father, whatever. But equally, there are these elements that are completely out of alignment. And I think you've got to ask yourself, are you happy? That's think to yourself, are you being your true self publicly and privately? Or are you seeking approval? Are you really happy? And if not, I know we're fearful. We always think not yet because we're worried what the other person might think, we're worried what our parents might think. I'll delay it. Turns out in my friend's example, the religious one, he got exposed by a postcard that was sent through with him in an image with somebody else, right? And it all broke through. But sometimes, we need to ask ourselves,
Well,
well,
the thing is,
life is short.
like,
Find happiness.
it is, but having spoken to people who are, say, in a relationship where, they're not neither of them really should be together with each other because they don't bring out, I don't think, the best
The
in
best
them.
in each other. Often they'll say that we're together for the kids, but the kids will. It's an excuse, I think.
I think it is and it is and it isn't. I mean, I can't comment because I'm not in that situation necessarily, but I can see how it might, on the face of it, seem better for the kids because you have the one household, you have the routine and all this and the other. But if both people are miserable in that, or I think even these particular people I'm thinking about have almost come to a not a disdain of each other. They still do things collectively, and they have their common friendship groups, and they're the quintessential looks like great couple, like doing all these things, but everyone close to them knows.
But like, if you see everyone on Instagram having loads and loads of fun and happiness, it's usually the opposite is true. Isn't
Yeah,
that the old cliche there?
it's not genuine, right? And I feel like they would both be better apart. But if they're staying together for the kids, I can kind of get it, but I still can't get it because like
I understand it because I understand how the brain works. And to give you a little bit of, I guess, a little bit of inside track on the book that I'm writing on fear, right? I've got this idea that fear's greatest disguise is wisdom. So we convince ourselves that it's the thing. It's that we must wait. That fear is disguised as prudence, fear is disguised as safety, fear is whatever it is. And I think we disguise it. We use those situations to benefit us because ultimately we're too afraid of making the decision that we really intuitively know we want to make. And I'm not saying kids aren't important in this situation, but ultimately, I would always say, do you want to do you want the kids brought up in a relationship or a household where neither of the parents are living values true to themselves? They're ultimately unhappy. They're introverted. They're living inside themselves. They're not really experiencing true happiness. Or is it a better environment to have the parents separated, but both of them able to live in alignment with their values to find happiness? Uh, I don't know the studies behind this, but I think sometimes we can weaponize children without knowing it because really we're too afraid of making the decision we really know intuitively we should be making. And we think, you know what, I'll just suffer it for 10 years until they're old enough to leave home, and then I'll make the decision because then I won't be impacting them so much. But I
we
don't
get
know.
used
I'm
to
not
a
saying it's
status
easy.
quo. I think the same goes for like people staying in jobs too long, staying in business partnerships too long. And whether it's the fear, I mean, I sometimes been thinking about this as well at the moment because I've been contemplating the one of the roles that I have teaching where I've been there for a long time now, 8 years, but I'm losing my mojo for it. And part of that is the travel, like the effort that it's taking. And I'm holding on to it partly because I think I notice a habit in myself of holding on to things longer than I need to have them. So that's a trait that I have that I'm aware of. Partly I'm using the excuse that I'm holding on to it because if I stop it, I don't have another teaching of that kind to go to, and it's better to have my foot in the door in one place so that I can keep that momentum because it's like, you work in payroll and HR and get people jobs. It's always easier to find a job when you're in a job than when you're not in a job, I
You're
find.
not coming from a place of need, right? It's
Yeah, not people showing some need. And so partly that's what's keeping me there. But I recognize that I feel like I don't know. I don't know if it's fear. Yeah, maybe it's fear of ultimately, I guess it's fear, right? But
I think
uh,
it is. I just
yeah,
think we tell ourselves it's something else. I mean, like, look, I told you for years I wanted to write my book, and I didn't, and I would always have a reason for it. I felt like when I do this, then I'll be good enough. When I've done my PhD, I'll be good enough. When I've done this podcast, then I'll be good enough. Like, it was always a reason. Fear was telling me ultimately that wait, it's safe, and it feels so logical because fear is telling me that's the right thing to do. But in reality, I just was worried that I wasn't good enough, that I'd get judged, that that's the real thing behind it. I had to label what the fear was in order for me to overcome it, and that's a good thing. We know that calms the parasympathetic nervous system when we do label our fears. But there's something called cognitive dissonance as well, which is when we start suppressing our truth. That can lead to stress in the body, that can lead to feelings of guilt, that can lead to burnout because we're not it's the internal tension is formed because we're not ultimately living in contradiction with our values, right? That is what the cognitive dissonance is. And it adds stress. And you'll be stressed about that decision you're making now. And it'll lead to stress and it'll lead to other
well,
things. We have it in relationships.
luckily
Very difficult.
it's not hugely stressful for me. I'm kind of, but it is. It does make me think because I think back to say like an old relationship I had, and I know that they had they were so into, I think it was capoeira at the time that I met that person, and they were going 4 times a week, they were traveling for it, and then they were also teaching yoga, and they wanted to teach yoga, and they were fearful of losing the capoeira because they have to focus on the one thing. They ended up deciding to ditch the capoeira and focus on the yoga, and ended up being very successful for them. But I remember she had to make some difficult decisions, but she was so much more clinical than I am. Uh, Once she'd kind of made a decision, she did it, and there was no. I think she had a place that she was teaching at, like a little crappy studio for like 6 years, and she made a decision to not teach her anymore because it was too far to travel based on where she was living at the time. And once she made that decision, there was no thinking beyond that. It was done. There was no residual linger of any thought. For me, my stuff is always drawn out so much more, like both prior to decision, often post the decision. And I just I reflect on that sometimes and think about, just pulling the band-aid off and just seeing what may. But yeah, I don't know.
I mean, look, even neurologically, we know when we're in alignment with our values, we're happier, we're firing, our brain fires up, we feel motivated, we feel inspired. And when we're not in alignment with our values, we're not feeling there is that cognitive distance I mentioned earlier, like that's when we feel that stress,
I'll
we're
tell you
not
something
feeling
else.
ourselves.
I'll tell you something else as well, which might help our listener. And it's something I kind of thought many times over the years, is when it comes to broaching a subject with your significant other or something like that, it can be often better come in when you say, "Oh, I've just been reading this article in the magazine, and they're doing this quiz about blah blah blah, or whatever." And so I don't know if this person has got a copy of my book, but if they do, then reading that chapter with your partner and say, "I listened to this podcast, or I've got this book by this guy, whatever. Here's a chapter on values. Should we do this together?" Right? Because actually, that might uncover something, right? Maybe you actually have similar values, but you have very different beliefs about how those values are met. For example, one example I remember, I think it was Tony Robbins talking about, is that we say that opposites attract, and he was saying, I don't think that's true, because, for example, let's say you've got very simple example, messy person, tidy person, and they end up in a relationship, and opposites attracting, but actually they might have the same belief, because that person might believe, okay, the woman should do all the tidying up, and therefore I'm going to leave it mess, and the woman might think, well, actually it's the woman to do the household, so I expect it to be messy. So you both have the same idea about what it is, who should perform what role, and so actually you're not opposite, you're actually in alignment. And so my point by saying that is that you may find that actually you do have similar values with the person that you're saying that you don't think you've got values with, but it might just be what they interpret needs to
Yeah,
happen
I,
for
I,
value to be
I think
met.
it wouldn't be. I think it's a healthy thing to do a values almost a values reorientation, right? To understand what they are. I think also they're using your messy, tidy example. They could actually be in complete opposition. But if there are bigger values at play that are completely in alignment, then almost that level of value is less than, you can have
This
an
is why I have
leveling scheme. It's the big values that are really important. But I think
That's
listeners,
why you
even as a
should
tool
order
for
that. That's why I
themselves.
would order them. So like the exercise is about ordering them as well. Because for example, if it's not a big value for you, like I don't know, whatever, travel, right? Then and it's a big value for that other person, you can kind of take it or leave it, but you'll probably likely like go with them. But if you had a value of your highest value was being a homebody, and the other person's highest value was being a traveler, then there would be a conflict. So ordering them is important, and there's a process for how you can order them. Again, they can read about that in one of the books I've written. But I think figuring out your order is really important, right? Figuring
And
out what your
I'd do a values view orientation. I would think, I'd get to listeners to think of a moment in your week when your values felt like they were under siege. What did you value in that moment? Where are your values being challenged? And this is the difficulty. Like, don't let your fear stop you from bringing them up. If you're with a partner or a parent, say, you know what, I didn't. I that really made me feel uncomfortable. I tried to go with what you've asked me to do, but I've been stressed all week, and it's not in alignment. Like, I'm not finding happiness in the situation, and we need to either find a way through, or I need to be honest with you about how I'm feeling. And I know it's fearful. So I'm not saying any of this is easy, because depending on
And
the
also,
situation,
I
it's gonna
think
be very difficult.
if there are people out there listening to this and they're not really relating, they go, "Oh no, I'm all good with that." I would say, think about values in another area of your life. So a big one, let's say, is activity, right? Fitness, and identify your values within that. Because I was chatting to my sister earlier. She's just joined the gym, literally at the end of her road now, and she loves it. And I've been saying for years, right? Proximity is power when it comes. Like, you want to be less than 5 minutes travel away from your place of exercise. Anything beyond 15 minutes, and it exponentially becomes very unlikely that you end up going consistently, at least according to my experience, the data, and a bunch of other things. And so, understanding what your values are in another area of life, let's say your whole relationship thing is fine, you can't relate to what we've been talking about at all, but you're really struggling with keeping a consistent exercise pattern, you might realize that actually what you value is community, and all the exercise stuff that you've been doing has been solitary, right? I know that you value I don't know, but I'm assuming you value some level of competition, some goal orientated thing, right? Because that tends to be, I know that when you haven't had that, you tend to be more out of shape, a lot more out of shape than when you've got that goal. Whereas I value, I guess, more flexibility, as in not flexibility, but as in my ability to adapt my exercise. Whereas I remember one of my friends, he was so rigid on his gym thing that when during COVID, when the gym shut, he couldn't like change things up. He couldn't change things up to exercise at home. It was really weird. But I think so. My point is that you can understand values in any area of your life, whether it comes to career, work, life, finances, whatever. So do a values exercise to understand them in an area that is of interest to you, I would say.
I
If you
think that ranking is important. I think also, depending on who you're negotiating with, and sometimes life is a negotiation in many ways, right? Recognize you may need to negotiate how you relate rather than what you believe. And I think that's where sometimes these things fall down. Sometimes me and Lucy may not see things the same way. That's my wife. But we have to understand how I can relate to what she's saying and what can I do, rather than just trying to be dogmatic with my views and go, well, I believe this, I'm doing this. It's like, well, I've got a lot of ADHD tendencies. And so she has to relate to me in a slightly different way than she'd maybe relate to you, Harry, who doesn't. So that's her understanding. Like, and you need a little bit of that. And she doesn't try and force a belief on me. And I don't think that's a healthy in any relationship, to force beliefs on anybody, right? I just think if intuitively, I'll go back to, we've talked about lots of episodes about how where things live in the body. We talk about gut feeling, and intuitively, if you're not feeling happy, if you're feeling in your gut, there's a knot, and that stress is it's only going to get bigger. It's going to get bigger, and that time is going to continue to pass you by if you don't do something with it. And don't let fear be the reason that you don't say something or take an action or do something, or it doesn't have to always be confronting. You'd like to think if you're with a loved one that they will be understanding in that moment. They're not going to be immediately confronting. I know we sometimes think it will be, but the fear will tell you to play it safe. And I guess my advice would be lean into that, and lean into the fear, not the safety, and go, if the person truly loves me, or respects me or likes me as a friend, whatever, they should give me the space to listen and and for me to tell them why I'm not fully comfortable. You and I have had loads of debates, right? But we always give each other the space to get a view across, and then we'll
Yeah.
challenge it, and it never affects whether I like you or dislike you at the end. And
No, but I
I think
think
that's
that's an
important.
important point though, because when it comes to a significant other, you're like, let's say I'm the one that wants to bring up the conversation, right? And I'm the one that thinks that my partner's not giving him value. And I have this beginning of a conversation. I would also urge the person bringing up that conversation to think about how fearful the other person is, because suddenly they're being their whole world is maybe going to change. That maybe that person will leave them if they don't line up with their ideas and beliefs, and so that person is entering into that conversation potentially, if it's not handled well, in that fight or flight stage where they're actually coming from it from a defensive point of view. I also would say I think it's really probably, I imagine, quite challenging to allocate time to do that, because I just know from experience of seeing my friends with the kids, everything is about getting the routine, getting the getting the dinner, getting the bed right, and where is that time to do that is quite
I
challenging.
don't
So
know, that for me, that's where fear's talking again. Fear is saying, "I haven't got the time." Like anything, if you're motivated enough, if you're unhappy enough, you'll find the time to have the
yes,
conversation.
my what I'm suggesting though with that is that to take yourself out of the environment that you're currently both in. So, not necessarily go for dinner or something, but try and have somewhere that you can go for a couple of hours to kind of flesh this out, or take the pen and paper, take the post-it notes, understand your values, make it fun, whatever the thing is, away from that environment where you can both be kind of a little bit freer,
Yeah,
if you
and
say.
probably if it's a relationship where I'd probably, I'm not a relationship expert by any stretch, but I would probably start with the positive things that are aligned. Start with what are the values we
We
both
won't know
share.
necessarily what those are, because
No, no, but that's a great place to start a positive conversation rather than go straight in with all the things you're unhappy with.
No,
That's what
I
I'm
wouldn't even
saying.
do that personally. I would start it off in almost like an isolation way. Like, here's a bunch of post-its for you. Here's a bunch of post-its for me. Let's write down what we think is important to our relationship or our life, and then don't say anything to each other. You have these post-its, and then go, okay, let's start placing them places or whatever, something like that. So you're not clouding each other by
I
starting the
get it.
conversation
I
straight
think
away.
that, and that would be, in a lot of cases that would be a perfect scenario. I think sometimes though it's more confrontational in relationships, that you and I could have that conversation because of where we are. If it was you and me sharing post-its, I think unfortunately a lot of relationships are quite confrontational. There is a lot of fear behind saying anything or being shut down or getting an aggressive response, or them leaving you or whatever, walking out. I think that makes it difficult. I'd always say if there's no respect though in that relationship, then there is no care anyway. You've got to be brave enough to hope that if you're in that relationship that they respect you enough to want to listen and want to do the work.
Well, I think it's also important to have like a in work, when I used to work at the London Stock Exchange, we used to have this thing. I think it was called like a terms of service or terms of reference or terms of something. It's like, what are the what are the basic fundamentals that we're going into this agreement with, or this conversation with? And I remember when I had let's say a very challenging conversation with a family member, probably coming on 4 years now, where that charge had been building up for decades and I needed to release it. And but before engaging in that conversation, and I might have mentioned this before, I basically created, kind of terms of reference or terms of engagement or rules of engagement. Let's call it rules of engagement, whatever. And it was my suggestions, but also asking her for her suggestions, because I wanted to know, you know, I wanted to approach this like not level headed, but like productively. So I think maybe something like that can be useful, where you say, look, okay, firstly, I'm coming into this conversation, know that I love you, right? And that everything I'm doing here is because I want our bond to be even stronger or whatever. Whatever things are. And actually I may say things that, and one of the things I said is that I would seek to find clarification before responding if I'm not clear on what that person was saying, or just things like that. I think is really useful to kind of come up with kind of like a rules of engagement before you do the engagement.
I agree. I think also be willing as well. Like we're not expecting everyone to go tick, 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 tick here. That's relationships. You're going to have values that differ, no matter who it's with. But if you have those, if you have the conversation, a lot of people aren't even having a conversation. If you have the conversation, it gives you the opportunity to commit to a small action you can take. That could be a question, setting boundaries, opening a dialogue. As long as it's grounded in compassion and truth and love and all those things, then you should be able to find hopefully a nice pathway through it. I think it's conflict doesn't have to be the enemy. It's when you mismanage that conflict, when there isn't that listening, there isn't that compassion to go, you know what? I've got me and Lucy live, as you know, we are different in many, many ways. She's given me certain boundaries, which it makes sense for me to be mindful of in my fitness. I want to go off to the Sahara and do the marathon des Sables and things like that, but I don't drink any water. She's like, you'll end up killing yourself. You've got 2 kids at
I
home.
actually wanted to do that
Well,
20 years ago.
go and do some races by all means. I'm not going to stop you doing racing or whatever, but there are limits to it. I would love to climb Everest. She wants to make sure the kids have got a dad. Like some of them you can border on selfishness, and I think you can have boundaries. And I'm giving 2 extreme examples, but even in a home life, right? I try and limit the amount of time I'm exercising at weekends so that we have our weekend time. And if that means I have to get up early in the weeks to get that stuff done, when it's not impacting on family time, then we can. That's the compromise element.
Yeah.
We are
I mean,
different
what I would
people.
say is like Lucy is unbelievably understanding as a wife, I
She
think.
is, to be fair. She is,
Like
to be fair.
she's
Anyone knows me,
like
I'll probably agree with that.
you wouldn't be able to, I think, live the life that you live with a lot of other people, if I'm honest, because
I agree. Yeah.
yeah. But also one thing I wanted to say, from a softer approach to this, let's all collect our values together and have this thing. And I'm sure I've mentioned this before, but I think it was Darren Hardy who is like a speaker or whatever that I remember hearing. And I liked something he said about what he did in his relationships. I can't remember if we talked about it before, but at the end of each, because often what happens is, like I said, someone does something in the relationship and it's not enough to annoy you to say anything, right? Maybe they don't offer you that cup of tea when you thought they could offer the cup of tea or open the door. And at the end of each week that they had this effectively like very 2-second assessment, like, on a scale of 1 to 10, how did you feel I was in the relationship, right? And if it wasn't a 10, right, what would it have taken to get to a 10? And so you go, oh, I'm an 8 out of 10. Oh, why only an 8? Well, because that was that time on Thursday where you know someone was criticizing me, and I really would have liked you to step up a little bit sooner, or something like that. And then you can move forward, improving the relationship. But it was a very kind of like soft approach. It's not like a grading or a pass or fail, even though you are kind of given a score. But I found that was really something that I would like to introduce in if ever I had a relationship, because I think just that constant feedback, because otherwise weeks and months and years can go by and these little things have suddenly become bigger and bigger and bigger.
Yeah, and that'll happen. And that me and Lucy do something. This was advised to us but years ago when we went to NCT classes with our first kid. And they were saying, sometimes we live in our own bubbles and we don't always appreciate that the other person's going through levels of stress. So in the end of an evening, certainly in our household, we like a glass of wine, as you know. And they were saying, just make sure that when you pour that glass of wine for yourself to ease yourself out of that really tough a day, that you always pour a glass for your partner, because there's nothing worse than me finishing, seeing you already relaxed. You're like, oh, I do not know. The least you could have done is, but actually, we always make sure if doing a glass of wine for each other or beer, whatever it is, even if it's a coffee, we'll always make sure there's one for the other. Because it's like, I don't know what your day's been like. It could have been a great day, could have been a bad day, but this is our chance to just come together and go, let's just,
Did you keep that?
always
I thought you'd stop doing the wine now. I know you stopped doing the walking and you were going to start doing the walking again, but then wasn't there a period where you kind of went off wine or something, or are you back
Yeah,
on?
well, I think we reduced our drinking is probably a better way of putting it, because we were drinking a lot of wine on a very regular basis, and yeah,
Do what I do,
that's
and I do a mushroom hot chocolate. I
yeah. No, I've tried yours. It's no, not for me, not yours actually. Good friend of mine introduced it to me. The game down. It was absolutely rancid. It's not for me. No.
I don't think you tried my one then, because
I
mine
didn't
isn't.
try your one. No, I've tried a friend and brought it down, and that wasn't for me. And I had
Oh,
mushroom coffee as well, which was
next
even
time you're
worse.
at mine, I'll make you a mushroom hot chocolate, and
Oh,
it's
mate. Well,
nice because I can even convince my nieces to drink it. So
well,
they
I'll go in with low expectations. So
go in with low
hopefully I'll be.
expectations. Yeah, go in with low expectations and bring some honey in your back pocket, and
There you go.
you'll
There you go.
be
Listen, it's been a good conversation. I think it's an interesting one, and there's no perfect responses. But
right.
I'll just say you and I both lost our parents recently. Life is short. Don't spend it unhappy. Do the things that are going to make you happy.
Yeah,
Don't
and you
not do
never
them
know.
for
You
fear
might
of something else.
the conversation, the challenging conversation that you feel like you might have might be something that the other person wanted, or you might be pleasantly surprised. Or the other thing is, if it is the case that you're on different paths, it might be a way that you can coexist with each other, especially if it's a friendship rather than an intimate relationship. But also, it can be a lonely journey sometimes when you are taking transformational steps at the beginning, because
And even your partner or your parent or your boss may have no idea of the impact they're having. They may have said something flippantly. A bit like I said to my kids, we're going back again now, as I've had this previous episode. So I always say to my kids, only boring people get bored. I had no idea of the impact I was having on them behind the scenes, that they were now worried that I was judging them. I was like, no, just as soon as they told me they were, they didn't, they were worried they were bored, if they didn't do something, or they were scared of telling me they were bored, basically, because they thought of my such a flippant thing for me to say. My daddy said it to me, I wasn't really thinking of the power of it really. And sometimes you might just go, actually, I had no idea that's how I was making you feel. But if you don't communicate it, write down. And I don't mind being vulnerable about my own flaws here. I told again on this show where I used to make toast in the morning, and it was driving Lucy nuts because I wasn't always wiping up the chopping board. And the argument, if it's just about that, it's a really small thing. But how it was making her feel is like she was Cinderella. Like, I'll just leave it because she'll clear. I wasn't thinking like that at all. But, but every single day, this was building and building and building. And then she suddenly noticed everything else. And I'm my bloody Cinderella. And I was like, it's just crumbs on it. It's never just about the washing up. It's never just about the crumbs on the chopping board. But if we hadn't communicated it, this would only keep building. And it's such a solvable, because there's respect in our relationship. And that's really important. If you lose that respect, then you shouldn't be in it anyway. There's always care. There's always love behind it. We're going to fall foul of certain things, and you just got to have that communication. But she said she'd have raised it earlier, but she was fearful. She was scared of how to react. She wanted an argument. It's like, well,
and
you
also,
know,
like I said, it can be such a small thing where you're like, it's just crumbs on a chopping board,
yeah, I
right?
was being an idiot. I wasn't considering how that was making her feel. I was just
Yeah.
viewing it as a literally
You are
the
very much
parts of what it is rather than
a
the emotional element.
moment. You're very much an in the moment person, and tidying up, cleaning things is a future pace thing as well. And whereas you're right, I've done the thing I needed to do, which was feed myself. Job, but the job wasn't feeding yourself. The job in her mind is feeding yourself and tidying up. you know, that's the thing, is you have a different definition of what the job was. But yeah, it's interesting. But that's what I say, like those weekly check-ins or some kind of thing, everyone will work out a different way of doing things for themselves. I think it's useful to stop that charge building up.
Good. Well, hopefully not too much of a heavy episode, but hopefully a valuable one. I hope we've answered some questions or given at least some insights for people to think about um, as they negotiate their own values and yeah, work out what they are. So I've enjoyed it, Harry. It's been a good chat. And
Yeah, yeah, as always. So I'm gonna go back to the other house, because that house hasn't got Wi-Fi. So I've come to this one for the Wi-Fi and cook and do a bit like a Nick and eat late tonight.
yeah,
So,
well, let's not. I haven't even started dinner yet, mate. So, but I'm gonna leave with one of your own quotes since we talk about your book, which is "Your vibe attracts your tribe." So if you feel like you're not in your tribe anymore, then and your vibe has been suppressed, then go do something about it. But that's a good one. Your vibe attracts your tribe. That's yours.
yeah. All right.
Good
Take
stuff.
care,
All right,
everybody.
Phil. Speak to you soon. Take care,
Bye bye.
buddy.